The wind whispered through the dying leaves of autumn as Yancy Quill rode into Ukiah, California, a man whose eyes carried the weight of too many gravestones. The year was 1879, and the small township nestled in Mendocino County had grown from a humble stagecoach stop to a settlement with ambitions beyond its dusty streets. Yancy's spurs clinked against the weathered boardwalk as he dismounted, his movements precise but weary, like a clock wound too many times. Dust clung to his weathered duster as he pushed through the batwing doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon. The piano player's fingers danced across yellowed keys while patrons nursed their drinks, conversations humming beneath the hazy glow of oil lamps. Yancy claimed a corner table, his back to the wall, a habit born from years on the trail where survival meant vigilance. "Whiskey," he said to the barkeep, his voice rough as sandpaper. The barkeep nodded, pouring amber liquid into a glass that had seen better days. "New in town, passing through," Yancy replied, though he had no destination in mind. At 32, he'd spent the better part of his life moving from one place to the next, leaving only footprints and occasionally freshly dug graves. The saloon doors swung open, allowing a burst of late afternoon sunlight to spill across the wooden floorboards. A woman stepped in, her silhouette momentarily backlit before she moved deeper into the room. Jasmine Juarez carried herself with quiet dignity, her simple dress clean but mended in places, dark hair pulled back in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. Their eyes met across the room, hers a warm brown that reminded Yancy of fertile earth, his the color of a storm-threatened sky. Something passed between them, fleeting but tangible, before she approached the bar. "Mr. Farley," she addressed the barkeep, "I've come for that job you mentioned." The barkeep's expression softened. "Of course, Miss Juarez. Kitchen needs help, and Millie can't manage alone anymore." Yancy watched her from beneath the brim of his hat, noting the determined set of her shoulders despite the evident fatigue in her stance. He recognized that same weariness in himself, the kind that came from fighting battles that never seemed to end. 3 days later, Yancy remained in Ukiah, telling himself he was giving his horse a needed rest. He'd taken odd jobs helping the blacksmith, mending fences at the livery, and each evening found himself at the same corner table at the Silver Dollar, nursing a single whiskey for hours. Jasmine worked efficiently in the kitchen and occasionally served tables when the saloon grew busy. She moved gracefully between rowdy cowboys and trail-worn travelers, deflecting unwanted advances with a firm politeness that rarely needed repeating. On the 4th night, a commotion erupted at a table of card players. Accusations of cheating spiraled quickly into drawn pistols. Patrons scattered, but Jasmine had been approaching with a tray of drinks. The first shot shattered a bottle behind the bar. The second would have found Jasmine if Yancy hadn't moved with the reflexive speed of a man who'd faced down death too many times. He pulled her to safety behind a toppled table, his body shielding hers as more shots rang out. Sheriff Holden arrived moments later, restoring order with his booming voice and steady revolver. "You could have been killed," Jasmine said afterward, hands still trembling as she wrapped a cloth around Yancy's arm where a bullet had grazed him. "Wouldn't be the first time someone tried," he replied, wincing slightly as she tightened the makeshift bandage. "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes meeting his directly. That night changed something between them. Yancy found himself walking Jasmine to her modest room behind the general store each evening after her shift ended. Their conversation started hesitantly snippets about the weather or town gossip, but gradually deepened. He learned she'd come west from Texas after losing her parents to fever 2 years prior. She'd worked as a seamstress, a teacher, whatever would keep her moving forward. He offered little about himself in return, but she never pressed. "I've noticed something about you, Mr. Quill," she said one evening as they walked beneath a blanket of stars. "You carry sadness like some men carry weapons." Yancy's step faltered. "Some burdens can't be set down, Miss Juarez." "I don't believe that," she replied softly, "but I respect your right to keep your ghosts private." A week turned into 2. Yancy took on more steady work with the local ranchers, surprising himself with each sunrise that didn't find him riding out of town. He told himself it was the peaceful valley that kept him there, the way the mountains cradled Ukiah like protective hands. He lied poorly, even to himself. Trouble arrived on a Tuesday in the form of 3 hard-eyed men who entered the saloon near sundown. Yancy recognized the type, immediately hired guns whose loyalty extended only as far as their payment. They surveyed the room with calculated indifference before settling at a table near the bar. The leader, a hawk-nosed man with a distinctive scar splitting his left eyebrow, kept watching Yancy throughout the evening. When Jasmine approached their table, the man grabbed her wrist, pulling her closer to whisper something that drained the color from her face. Yancy was on his feet instantly, but Jasmine extricated herself with forced composure and continued working, though her hands shook slightly as she poured drinks. "What did he say to you?" Yancy asked later, walking her home. "Nothing of importance," she insisted, but her voice carried an edge of fear he hadn't heard before. "Just another man who thinks women exist for his entertainment." Yancy knew a lie when he heard one, but he didn't press. Instead, he found himself lingering outside her door that night, watching the street until dawn painted the horizon with streaks of pink and gold. The next morning, Sheriff Holden found Yancy at the livery, brushing down his chestnut gelding. "Those men asking about you," the sheriff said without preamble. "Name of Yancy Quill mean anything to Wells Fargo?" Yancy's hand stilled on the brush. "I rode shotgun for them years back, nothing more." These fellows seemed to think different. The sheriff studied him with shrewd eyes. "Said you might have some unfinished business from a stage robbery near Tombstone." "That was 6 years ago," Yancy said quietly. 3 good men died that day. And the bandits, most of them joined those men in the ground." Yancy resumed brushing his horse. "Whatever they're looking for, it's not justice," the sheriff nodded slowly. "Just so we understand each other, Quill. Ukiah's a peaceful town. I aim to keep it that way. As do I, Sheriff." After Holden left, Yancy leaned against his horse, memories flooding back like poisoned water. The stagecoach ambush had been brutal, unexpected, and overwhelming. He'd survived by pure luck, a bullet grazing his temple instead of finding its mark. When he'd regained consciousness, the bandits were gone, along with the shipment of gold. His friends' men who'd shared campfires and stories and dreams lay cold in the Arizona dirt. He'd tracked the surviving bandits for months, a one-man vendetta that had consumed him until each outlaw faced his retribution. All except one, the leader, who'd vanished like smoke. Yancy had eventually abandoned the hunt, but the ghosts of his friends rode with him still, silent passengers on an endless journey. Now, it seemed, the past had found him instead. That evening, Yancy entered the saloon earlier than usual, noting with relief that the 3 strangers were absent. Jasmine worked the floor, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. He watched her move between tables, wondering what secrets she carried that mirrored his own. "You should leave town," she said quietly when she brought his whiskey. "Those men, they're dangerous." "I'm familiar with danger, Miss Juarez. So am I." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. She hesitated, then continued. "The man with the scar, his name is Burke. He was in El Paso the same time I was." Understanding dawned slowly. "You know him?" "I knew his brother," she corrected. He was a bank clerk who took a liking to me. When I refused his advances, he became insistent. Yancy's jaw tightened. What happened? There was a struggle. He fell and hit his head. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It was an accident, but his family had influence. I fled before they could hang me for murder. The pieces clicked into place. And now Burke has found you. Just as someone has found you. Her gaze was steady despite the fear he could sense beneath her composure. It seems we both have pasts that won't stay buried. Yancy drained his whiskey. Pack your things tonight. I'll meet you at the livery before dawn. You're suggesting we run. I'm suggesting we live, he countered. Sometimes the wisest fight is the one you walk away from. She studied him for a long moment before nodding once and returning to her duties. Yancy left shortly after, making preparations for their departure. He purchased supplies at the general store, grateful for the earnings he'd saved from his recent work. As midnight approached, Yancy sat in his rented room above the livery, cleaning his Colt revolver by lamplight. The familiar ritual steadied his hands and cleared his thoughts. He would get Jasmine safely away from Ukiah, perhaps north toward Oregon territory, where both their pasts might have difficulty following. A soft knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. He opened it cautiously, surprised to find Jasmine standing there, a small bundle clutched in her arms. I couldn't wait until morning, she explained, stepping inside when he moved aside. Burke came back to the saloon with his men. They were asking questions, looking for both of us. Yancy secured the door behind her. Did they follow you? No. I slipped out the back when Millie created a distraction. Her eyes reflected the lamplight as she looked up at him. I'm sorry to bring this trouble to your door. The trouble was already coming for me, he replied, holstering his revolver. We'll leave now. The moon's bright enough for traveling. They moved silently through the sleeping town, keeping to shadows until they reached the livery. Yancy saddled his gelding quickly, securing their meager belongings behind the saddle. Can you ride? He asked, offering her a hand up. Since I could walk, she replied, mounting with practiced ease. Yancy swung up behind her and they set off at a steady pace, avoiding the main road out of town. They rode through the night, following game trails and creek beds whenever possible to obscure their tracks. Jasmine sat stiffly at first, maintaining a careful distance despite their forced proximity, but as the hours passed, fatigue overcame propriety. She leaned back against his chest, her breathing eventually steadying into sleep. Yancy remained vigilant, one arm securely around her waist as he guided the horse through the darkened landscape. Dawn found them in the foothills, where he finally allowed a brief rest beside a small stream. We should reach Peterson's mill by nightfall, he said as they shared jerky and hardtack. We can get you your own horse there. And then, she asked, splashing cold water on her face. North, he suggested, unless you have someplace else in mind. Jasmine dried her face with her sleeve, considering. I've never seen the ocean. Something about her simple statement stirred an unexpected warmth in Yancy's chest. Then we'll head west after Peterson's mill. The Pacific isn't more than 100 miles. They continued their journey, more at ease with each other as they shared the saddle and quiet conversation. Jasmine spoke of her childhood in Texas, her father's small ranch, her mother's garden. Yancy found himself offering stories in return his years as a young cowhand in Kansas, driving cattle north from Texas. The friendships forged on those long drives. How did you become a shotgun rider? She asked, as they followed a ridge overlooking a vast valley. The question brushed against tender memories. A friend convinced me, said it paid better than punching cows and I'd see more country. He fell silent for a moment. His name was Ellis, first friend I buried. Jasmine didn't respond immediately, respecting the weight of his words. Finally, she said, "Tell me about him." No one had ever asked about the dead that haunted him. Yancy found himself speaking of Ellis Mason, his boisterous laugh, his terrible singing, his unwavering loyalty. Then came stories of the others. Malcolm with his card tricks, Josiah who could recite Shakespeare from memory, Thomas who'd saved for years to buy land for his sweetheart. "They sound like good men," Jasmine said softly when he finally fell silent. "The best," he agreed, throat tight. "They deserved better than what they got. As did you." Her hand covered his where it rested at her waist. "Surviving isn't a sin, Yancy." They reached Peterson's mill by sunset, a small logging settlement with a general store, a smithy, and a modest boarding house. Yancy secured separate rooms for them and purchased a sturdy paint mare for Jasmine after determining no one had passed through asking about strangers. That night, over a simple meal in the boarding house dining room, they planned their route to the coast. The easy conversation between them felt like a gift, something Yancy hadn't experienced in years. "We should be able to reach Fort Bragg in 3 days if the weather holds," he explained, tracing the route on a rough map he'd purchased. Jasmine nodded, but her attention seemed divided. "Yancy," she said finally, "what happens after we reach the ocean?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been focused solely on ensuring their immediate safety, not considering what might follow. "I suppose that depends on what you want." "What about what you want?" she countered. Yancy stared into his coffee cup. "I stopped wanting things a long time ago, Jasmine. Wanting means losing eventually." Her hand found his across the table. "That's a lonely way to live. It's kept me alive. There's a difference between living and surviving." Her fingers tightened around his. "I've done both. Living is better." Sleep came uneasily to Yancy that night. Jasmine's words echoed in his thoughts, challenging the walls he'd built around himself since Tombstone. He'd existed in a state of suspended animation, moving from place to place without allowing connections to form, preserving himself from further loss by refusing to gain anything of value. They departed early the next morning, their new horses rested, and their saddlebags replenished with supplies. The trail led them through dense forests of redwood and pine, the air growing heavier with moisture as they neared the coast. Jasmine rode with confidence, occasionally humming softly to herself. By midday, rain began falling, gentle at first, then increasing to a steady downpour that soaked through their clothes. They sought shelter beneath a massive redwood, its enormous canopy providing some protection from the worst of the deluge. "We should wait it out," Yancy decided, helping Jasmine dismount. "These coastal storms can pass quickly." They huddled together beneath the ancient tree, sharing a blanket around their shoulders. The forest around them seemed transformed by the rain, vibrant greens intensified against the dark, wet bark of the trees. Water dripped from Jasmine's hair, tracing paths down her cheeks like tears. Without thinking, Yancy brushed a droplet away with his thumb. Her skin was cold beneath his touch, but her eyes warmed as they met his. For a moment, neither moved nor spoke, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment. Bark exploded from the tree trunk inches from Jasmine's head. Yancy reacted instantly, pulling her down and behind the massive redwood trunk as a second shot rang out. "Burke," Jasmine whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Stay down," Yancy ordered, drawing his revolver. He peered carefully around the tree, trying to locate the shooter through the curtain of rain. Movement caught his eye: 3 figures on horseback approximately 100 yards upslope, partially concealed by the forest. "How did they find us?" Jasmine asked, pressing herself against the tree trunk. "Doesn't matter now." Yancy checked his ammunition. Our horses are too exposed. We need to move deeper into the forest on foot. Another shot kicked up earth near their position. They were pinned down with limited visibility and diminishing options. I'll draw their fire, Yancy decided. When I do, run northeast through those trees. There's a ravine about 30 yards in. Get to it and follow it downhill. I'm not leaving you, she protested. This isn't a debate, Jasmine. His voice was firm but gentle. I'll find you, I promise. Before she could argue further, Yancy fired 2 quick shots in the direction of their pursuers, then darted to another tree several yards away. The response was immediate, multiple shots tracking his movement. Jasmine seized the opportunity, running low through the underbrush in the direction he'd indicated. Yancy continued providing covering fire, heart pounding as he watched her disappear into the forest. Only when she was out of sight did he focus fully on the immediate threat. One of the riders had dismounted and was working his way through the trees, trying to flank Yancy's position. The rain provided some concealment, but it also masked the sound of approaching footsteps. Yancy moved silently from tree to tree, circling behind where he'd last seen movement. A shadow materialized through the rain, Burke, rifle raised, scanning the forest. Yancy emerged from behind a massive fern, revolver aimed steadily. "Drop it," he commanded. Burke froze, then slowly lowered his rifle. "Quill," he acknowledged, turning to face him. "Been a long time." "Not long enough." Yancy kept his distance, wary of tricks. "Why are you hunting me after all these years?" A cold smile spread across Burke's scarred face. "Unfinished business. The gold from that stage never turned up. My employer believes you know where it is." "Your employer is mistaken." "That's not what Tucker said before he died." Burke's eyes narrowed. "Said you and Hartford made a deal." The accusation hit Yancy like a physical blow. Hartford had been the leader of the stagecoach ambush, the one who'd escaped his vengeance. Tucker was lying. Hartford and I weren't partners. "I hunted him for months, and conveniently never found him." Burke shrugged. "Doesn't matter what I believe. I'm paid to bring you in alive if possible. And Jasmine, what's she to you? Personal matter." Burke's expression hardened. "My brother deserves justice." "He deserved what he got," Yancy countered. "Now call off your men. This ends here." A flicker of movement in Yancy's peripheral vision was his only warning. He threw himself sideways as a shot rang out, pain exploding through his left shoulder. He returned fire instinctively, catching one of Burke's men in the chest before rolling behind a fallen log. Burke used the distraction to retrieve his rifle, firing rapidly at Yancy's position. Splinters flew as bullets tore into the rotting wood. Yancy's injured arm hung useless, blood soaking his shirt sleeve. He fired his remaining shots carefully, forcing Burke and his remaining man to seek cover. In the brief lull that followed, Yancy slipped away, moving downhill through the forest. His vision swam with each step, blood loss weakening him as he pushed through the dense undergrowth. He had to find Jasmine before Burke regrouped. The ravine appeared ahead, a narrow cut in the forest floor filled with rushing rainwater. Yancy half climbed, half slid down the muddy slope, following the water's path downhill. His boot prints would be washed away by the torrent, buying him precious time. He stumbled forward for what seemed like hours, the world narrowing to the next step, the next breath. The rain eventually slackened, though water continued to drip from the canopy above. Darkness was approaching when Yancy spotted a small cave-like opening beneath the twisted roots of a fallen giant. "Jasmine," he called softly, approaching cautiously. She emerged from the shelter, relief flooding her features before concern took its place. "You're hurt," she gasped, rushing to support him as he swayed on his feet. "Just grazed me," he lied, allowing her to help him into the makeshift shelter. It was surprisingly dry inside, with enough space for them to sit upright. Jasmine worked quickly, tearing strips from her petticoat to bandage his wound after cleaning it with rainwater. Her hands were gentle but sure, and Yancy found himself watching her face as she concentrated, memorizing the furrow between her brows, the determined set of her mouth. "I think the bullet went through," she said finally, securing the bandage. "But you've lost a lot of blood." "We need to keep moving at first light," Yancy responded, leaning back against the earthen wall. "Burke won't give up easily." "Who is he to you?" Jasmine asked, settling beside him. Yancy closed his eyes briefly. "He works for a man named Chandler, who financed the stagecoach robbery years ago." Burke was probably supposed to eliminate all witnesses afterward, but the job went sideways when another gang tried to hit the same stage. "And now he thinks you have the gold. He thinks I made a deal with Hartford, the man who led the robbery." Yancy shook his head. "Hartford escaped with the gold while I was unconscious. I spent months tracking him, but the trail went cold in New Mexico." Jasmine was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "So we're both running from false accusations." "Seems so." Yancy shifted, wincing as pain shot through his shoulder. "Try to rest. I'll keep watch." "You need sleep more than I do," she argued gently. "Let me watch first." Too exhausted to protest, Yancy nodded, allowing his eyes to close. He drifted into uneasy sleep, dreams filled with gunfire and the faces of dead friends. He woke to Jasmine's hand on his good shoulder and the gray light of dawn filtering through the root structure above them. "No sign of Burke or his men," she reported, "but I found something you should see." She helped him out of their shelter, supporting him as they walked a short distance through the forest. The ravine had widened into a small valley, and ahead, partially obscured by trees, stood an abandoned cabin, its roof sagging but still intact. "It looks like an old trapper's place," Yancy observed as they approached cautiously. The cabin was indeed long abandoned, dust and leaves covering the rough plank floor. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and crude furnishings, a table, chair, and platform bed, remained in place. Most importantly, it was defensible, with small windows that could serve as firing positions if needed. "We can rest here," Yancy decided. "At least until I can use this arm properly again." They spent the day making the cabin habitable, Jasmine sweeping out debris while Yancy, one-handed, gathered firewood from the nearby forest. By nightfall, a small fire burned in the hearth, and they'd fashioned a more comfortable sleeping area from pine boughs covered with their blankets. "Our horses are probably back in Peterson's mill by now," Yancy said as they shared the last of their provisions. "We're on foot until we can find another settlement." "How far do you think we are from the coast?" Jasmine asked, gazing out the single window at the darkening forest. "Maybe 20 miles. Hard to say without landmarks I recognize." Silence settled between them, comfortable despite their circumstances. Jasmine stoked the fire, adding another small log before speaking again. "Why did you help me, Yancy? You could have left Ukiah alone when Burke arrived." He considered his answer carefully. "I've spent years running from connections, telling myself it was safer that way." His eyes met hers across the firelight. "But when I saw you in danger, I realized something. The pain of losing people you care about, it's terrible. But never allowing yourself to care at all might be worse." Jasmine moved to sit beside him, her shoulder touching his good one. "When I was a child, my mother had a saying, El corazón que ha sufrido sabe reconocer el dolor en otros." "What does it mean?" "A heart that has suffered knows how to recognize pain in others." She turned to face him fully. "From the moment I saw you in that saloon, I recognized something familiar. Not just pain, but strength. The kind that comes from surviving what should have broken you." Yancy's hand found hers in the flickering shadows. "I've buried too many friends, Jasmine. I don't know if I can bear to lose anyone else." Her fingers tightened around his. "Then let me stay by you. Whatever comes, we face it together." The simplicity of her words broke something open inside him, a door long sealed shut. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she met him halfway. Their kiss was gentle at first, a question being answered, before deepening into something that felt like coming home after years in the wilderness. When they finally separated, Yancy rested his forehead against hers. "Together," he agreed, the word a promise. They spent 3 days in the cabin, allowing Yancy's wound to heal enough for travel. Each day brought them closer, stories and touches and quiet moments building a foundation beneath their growing feelings. Jasmine proved skilled at improvising with the limited resources available, crafting fishing hooks from bent nails she found in the cabin walls, weaving containers from supple pine roots to gather berries and edible plants she recognized. On the 4th morning, they set out toward the coast, following the small stream that ran near the cabin. Yancy's arm remained in a sling fashioned from Jasmine's shawl, but he could now move without the constant pain of the first days. Burke could still be searching, he cautioned as they walked. "We need to remain vigilant." "You think he'd follow us this far?" Jasmine asked, helping him navigate a slippery embankment. "Depends on how badly Chandler wants what he thinks I have." Yancy frowned. "Burke strikes me as a man who completes his assignments." They traveled carefully, avoiding open ground whenever possible. By midday, the forest began to thin, and the air carried the unmistakable tang of salt. The terrain grew more rugged, with rocky outcroppings replacing the dense woods. Late afternoon brought them to a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean, endless blue stretching to the horizon, waves crashing against the rocks below. Jasmine stood transfixed, the wind tugging at her hair as she gazed out at the spectacle. "It's more beautiful than I imagined," she breathed. Yancy watched her face, finding more beauty there than in the natural wonder before them. "We'll follow the coastline north," he said after a moment. "There are fishing settlements where we might find work and transportation." They made camp that night in a protected cove, a small fire warding off the coastal chill. Jasmine sat close to Yancy, her head resting on his good shoulder as they watched the stars emerge above the endless sea. "What will we do?" she asked softly. "If we find a place to settle, I mean." The question held weight, acknowledging a future together beyond their immediate escape. Yancy considered it seriously. "I've saved most of what I earned over the years," he said. "Enough to buy land, maybe, build something." He turned to look at her. "What would you want?" A smile played at her lips. "A garden, like my mother had, and maybe a school someday. I enjoyed teaching when I had the chance." Yancy could see it clearly, a small house overlooking the ocean, Jasmine tending vegetables and flowers, children gathering to learn under her patient guidance. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a future worth fighting for. Their moment of peace shattered at dawn with the crack of a rifle. The bullet struck sand inches from where they'd been sleeping, sending them scrambling for cover behind nearby rocks. "Found you," Burke's voice called from the bluff above. "Impressive tracking, considering you left almost no trail." Yancy peered carefully around the boulder, spotting Burke and his remaining man positioned on the cliff edge, rifles aimed down at their position. They were exposed, with only the rock formation providing cover and the ocean at their backs. "It's over, Quill," Burke continued. "Tell me where Hartford hid the gold and I might let the woman live." "I don't know where it is," Yancy shouted back. "Hartford vanished with it years ago." "Not according to the letter we found," Burke replied. "Hartford wrote to you before he died, Said you'd know where to look. Confusion swept through Yancy. What letter? I never received anything from Hartford. Found it among Tucker's things after I questioned him. Burke's voice carried a note of triumph. It mentioned Ukiah, that's how we traced you. Hartford said he left something for you there, something that would make things right. Realization dawned slowly. Hartford had tried to contact him, perhaps to make amends or share the location of the stolen gold, but the letter had never reached him. Whatever Hartford left, I never found it, Yancy called. I was just passing through Ukiah. Then you're no use to me alive. Burke adjusted his aim. Jasmine squeezed Yancy's hand. The tide pools, she whispered, nodding toward a narrow path that snaked down the cliff face to their right. We might reach them if we move quickly. Yancy nodded, understanding her plan. On my signal, he murmured, drawing his revolver. He fired 3 rapid shots toward Burke's position, forcing the men to duck, then grabbed Jasmine's hand. They sprinted along the base of the cliff, bullets kicking up sand behind them as they reached the narrow path. It was treacherous wet stone slick with sea spray, but they navigated it quickly, half climbing, half sliding down to where the ocean had carved natural pools in the rocky shore. The tide was coming in, waves crashing closer as they sought shelter among the larger rock formations. Burke and his companion would have to descend the cliff to follow, giving them precious minutes. There, Jasmine pointed to a dark opening in the cliff face, a sea cave partially submerged at its entrance. We can hide there until they pass. They waded through shallow water to reach the cave, grateful to find the interior remained above the waterline, though the incoming tide would eventually fill it. The cave extended deeper than it first appeared, a twisted passage leading away from the entrance. This might connect to other caverns, Yancy suggested, examining the passage. Coastal caves often form networks. They moved deeper, guided by what little light filtered through from the entrance. The passage narrowed, then widened again, eventually opening into a larger chamber where a small shaft of sunlight penetrated from somewhere above, illuminating their surroundings. Jasmine gasped softly. The chamber walls glittered with mineral deposits, catching and reflecting the meager light. But it wasn't the natural beauty that had captured her attention. It was the wooden chest positioned on a natural stone shelf, partially covered by a canvas tarp. Yancy, she whispered, pointing. He approached cautiously, pulling back the weathered canvas to reveal a battered strongbox, the kind used by express companies to transport valuables. Stamped on its lid was a faded Wells Fargo emblem. It can't be, he breathed, running his fingers over the lock. Using a stone, Yancy managed to break open the rusted lock. Inside lay canvas bags bearing the same Wells Fargo stamp and a sealed envelope addressed simply, Quill. With shaking hands, Yancy opened the letter, reading aloud for Jasmine to hear. Quill, if you're reading this, then you finally found what I took that day in Tombstone. I never meant for your friends to die. It was supposed to be a simple robbery, but Chandler's men had orders I didn't know about. I've been running all these years, looking over my shoulder, knowing either you or Chandler would eventually find me. I'm dying now. Consumption's got its hooks in deep. Before I go, I wanted to make things right. This gold belongs to Wells Fargo, but I've removed enough to leave at the graves of Ellis, Malcolm, Josiah, and Thomas. Their families should have something for what they lost. The rest I leave to your conscience. Maybe it buys you peace. Maybe it just buys you a new start. Hartford's silence filled the cave as Yancy folded the letter. The gold cause of so much death and suffering sat before them, its presence almost unreal after so many years. Hartford hid it here, Jasmine said softly. But how did he know you'd find it? He didn't. Yancy shook his head slowly. This was his hiding place. The letter he sent to Ukiah must have given clues to this location. He looked around the cave with new understanding. We stumbled upon it by pure chance or fate, perhaps. Footsteps and voices echoed from the cave entrance, interrupting their discovery. Burke and his man had found their trail. "We need to move," Yancy whispered, securing the letter inside his shirt. "Leave the gold." Jasmine's eyes widened. "But it's never been about the gold," he said firmly. "Let Burke take it back to Chandler. Maybe then they'll stop hunting us." They searched frantically for another exit, finally discovering a narrow fissure at the back of the chamber that opened onto a steep ravine climbing back to the clifftop. Jasmine went first, with Yancy following despite the pain in his injured shoulder. They emerged on the bluffs several hundred yards from where Burke had ambushed them, the sound of the sea masking their movement as they put distance between themselves and the cave. By nightfall, they'd reached a small fishing village called Noyo Harbor. The few buildings clustered around a natural inlet where fishing boats bobbed at their moorings. Exhausted and hungry, they approached the only establishment showing lights, a modest boarding house with a hand-painted sign offering hot meals and clean beds. The elderly woman who ran the place asked no questions about their disheveled appearance, simply offering food and lodging in exchange for Yancy's remaining coins. They ate ravenously fish stew and brown bread before being shown to a small but clean room on the second floor. "We should be safe here for tonight," Yancy said, checking that the window offered an escape route if needed. "Tomorrow we'll see about finding work or passage north." Jasmine sat on the edge of the narrow bed, untangling her salt-stiffened hair with her fingers. "Do you think Burke found the gold?" "Most likely." Yancy leaned against the windowsill, watching the harbor lights reflect on the water. "If he did, maybe that's the end of it. And if not," Yancy turned to face her, "then we keep moving until we find a place they can't follow." Jasmine rose and crossed to him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "As long as we're together, I don't care where that place is." He cupped her face gently, overwhelmed by the trust she placed in him, this remarkable woman who'd faced her own demons and still retained the capacity for hope. "Together," he affirmed, sealing the promise with a kiss that spoke of futures yet to be written. Morning brought clear skies and an unexpected visitor. Yancy was speaking with a boat captain about possible work when Sheriff Holden from Ukiah stepped onto the dock. "Quite a chase you've led, Quill," Holden said, approaching without reaching for his weapon. Yancy tensed, positioning himself between the sheriff and the boarding house where Jasmine remained. "How did you find us?" Followed the trail of bodies Burke left. Holden's expression was grim. "Found him and his man dead in a cave down the coast. Looked like they had a disagreement over something valuable they found." Relief and wariness battled within Yancy. "Why are you here, Sheriff?" Holden reached into his vest pocket, extracting a folded paper. "This arrived for you, day after you left town. Figured it might be important, given those men hunting you." Yancy accepted the letter cautiously, recognizing the same handwriting as the note in the cave. This must be the letter Burke had mentioned, the one that had led them to Ukiah in the first place. "Burke's employer sent more men after his first crew disappeared," Holden continued. "They were asking questions all over town. I suggested they might have better luck in Oregon." A small smile crossed his weathered face. "Gave them detailed directions to nowhere in particular." "Why help us?" Yancy asked, studying the sheriff carefully. Holden shrugged. "Miss Juarez is a good woman, and I did some checking on you, Quill. Wells Fargo still speaks highly of your service. Whatever happened years ago, I figure you've carried the weight of it long enough." The sheriff tipped his hat and turned to leave, then paused. "That gold technically belongs to Wells Fargo, you know. Reward for its return would be substantial." "What gold?" Yancy asked innocently. Holden chuckled. "That's what I thought. Good luck to you both." After the sheriff departed, Yancy returned to their room where Jasmine waited anxiously. He showed her the letter, and together they read Hartford's first message directions to the sea cave where he'd hidden the stolen shipment, along with his confession and desire to make amends. "What now?" Jasmine asked when they'd finished reading. "Burke's men will still be looking for us, even without Burke." Yancy sat beside her on the bed, taking her hands in his. "Hartford left the gold for me to return. The reward would be enough to start fresh, somewhere far from here. Then we should return it," she said without hesitation. "Only part of it," Yancy countered, a plan forming. "We'll send most back to Wells Fargo anonymously with Hartford's confession, but keep enough to honor his wish to provide for my friends' families." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "And perhaps enough for land of our own. A garden, maybe a school someday." Hope bloomed in Jasmine's eyes. "You want that too? I want a life with you," he said simply. "Whatever form that takes." 3 days later, they boarded a coastal steamer bound for San Francisco. A portion of the gold secured in their luggage, while the majority had been carefully packaged and sent to the Wells Fargo office with Hartford's letter of confession. The company would likely never know who had returned their lost shipment, and Chandler would have no reason to continue hunting for what was no longer missing. As the small harbor receded behind them, Jasmine stood at the rail, the wind catching her hair as Yancy wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Are you afraid?" she asked, leaning back against his chest. "Not anymore," he replied truthfully. "For years I've been haunted by those I couldn't save, but now—" He turned her gently to face him. "Now I'm thinking of those I can love, including yourself." Her eyes searched his. Yancy smiled, the expression feeling less foreign than it once had. "I'm learning, with your help." The steamer's whistle blew as they pulled further from shore, signaling the beginning of their journey south. But for Yancy Quill, a man who had spent years running from attachments and burying his heart alongside his friends, the true journey had already begun the moment Jasmine Juarez had looked at him across a dusty saloon and recognized a kindred spirit. "I was thinking," he said as they watched the coastline slowly transform, "when we reach San Francisco, perhaps we should make our arrangement more permanent." Jasmine raised an eyebrow, though her smile betrayed her understanding. "Are you asking me something, Mr. Quill?" "I believe I am, Miss Juarez." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I've spent too many years alone with ghosts. I'd rather spend whatever years I have left with you." "Then yes," she said simply, rising on tiptoes to press her lips to his. "I would be honored to help you build something worth living for." They were married in San Francisco by a justice of the peace, with only the gulls circling overhead as witnesses. Using part of the gold, they purchased passage on a steamer heading north to Seattle, where the growing territory offered opportunities for those willing to work hard and start anew. Near a settlement called Port Townsend, they found what they were looking for: a modest parcel of land overlooking the Strait of Juan de Fuca, with mountains visible in the distance and fertile soil for Jasmine's garden. They built a small house first, working side by side through summer and fall to create a home before winter arrived. As promised, Yancy sent portions of the remaining gold to the families of his fallen friends, each package accompanied by a letter explaining that their loved ones had not been forgotten. The rest they invested carefully in their new beginning, expanding their home, purchasing livestock, and eventually building a small schoolhouse where Jasmine began teaching the children of neighboring homesteads. Word of Chandler's death reached them a year later, through a newspaper article describing how the wealthy businessman had been arrested for fraud and died awaiting trial. With him died any remaining threat to their hard-won peace. On clear evenings, Yancy would often sit on their porch, watching Jasmine tend her garden as the sun set over the water. Sometimes he'd imagine his old friend sitting beside him, sharing in the contentment he'd finally allowed himself to embrace. "What are you thinking about?" Jasmine would ask, coming to sit beside him with dirt still under her fingernails and love in her eyes. "How lucky I am," he'd reply, pulling her close. "How some losses lead to findings you never expected." 5 years after settling in Port Townsend, their family grew with the birth of their daughter, Elena, followed 2 years later by their son, Thomas, named for one of the friends Yancy had carried in his heart for so long. The children grew strong in the coastal air, learning both Jasmine's native Spanish and the stories of the people who had shaped their parents' journey. Yancy taught them to ride and fish, while Jasmine nurtured their minds with books and music. Together, they created the home that both had once thought beyond their reach, a place where the past was honored but never allowed to overshadow the present. On their 10th anniversary, as they walked along the shore near their home, Jasmine asked a question that had lingered unspoken between them for years. "You ever regret it, leaving the life you knew, settling here with me?" Yancy stopped, turning to face the woman who had transformed his existence from mere survival to true living. The years had added silver threads to her dark hair and fine lines around her eyes that appeared when she smiled, which was often. "I buried too many friends before I met you," he said, taking her hands in his. "Each grave was a piece of myself I thought I'd never get back." He glanced toward their home on the bluff, where their children played in the yard under the watchful eye of their dog, Ranger. "But you showed me that the heart has room for both remembrance and new beginnings." Jasmine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she squeezed his hands. "Then let me stay by you," she whispered, echoing the words that had changed both their lives a decade before, "for all the days to come." "Always," Yancy promised, gathering her into his arms as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of gold and pink colors as vibrant and precious as the life they had built together from the ashes of their separate pasts. And so they remained, two souls who had found in each other not just love, but redemption, proof that even hearts scarred by loss could learn to beat with purpose again, creating a legacy of love that would endure long after they were gone.